But in terms of actually beginning now to ease the sanctions pressure, I think it's way premature.
The United States is saying, fine, we'll be providing incentives, but we really can't go beyond symbols.
If President Moon wants to see progress on denuclearization, shouldn't he be urging North Korea to take concrete steps?
I think the ASEM statement does represent a victory for U.S. diplomacy behind the scenes.
The Trump administration understands that it has to be the enforcer of sanctions. If the interests continue to diverge, I think secondary sanctions are at least a possibility.
If the South gets too far out in front of the denuclearization process, the U.S. pulls on the South Koreans, tries to increase pressure on the North to move.
From the Voice of America, this is Washington Talk.
Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm In-jung Cho. South Korean President Moon Jae-in this week focused his efforts on persuading European leaders to relax sanctions on North Korea. This comes at a time when the U.S. is urging countries to maintain pressure on North Korea. Should Seoul be promoting sanctions relief at this time?
국제사회가 주어가면서 북한이 빠르게 비핵화를 할 수 있도록 이끌어내야 한다고 생각합니다.
Now my guest today, Dr. Patrick Cronin, Senior Director at the Center for a New American Security. Dr. Cronin spent more than 3 decades in the U.S. government and think tanks focusing on Asia policy. Also joining us today, Mr. Frank Jannuzi, President of the Mansfield Foundation and former advisor to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Welcome to the program.
Good morning.
Thank you.
President Moon Jae-in emphasized to France and UK, the permanent members of the UN Security Council, on the need to ease sanctions on North Korea, saying that this will accelerate the denuclearization process. If President Moon wants to see progress on denuclearization, shouldn't he be urging North Korea to take concrete steps rather than making a tour on sanctions relief?
Well, it may be easier to change the minds of democracies than North Korea, but sure, yes, he needs to obviously work on North Korea, and I think he has done that in his conferences, his meetings, his summits, but Europe also matters, permanent members of the UN Security Council matter, so he is obviously doing his due diligence here internationally to try to line up support for both sanctions relief if North Korea denuclearizes and seeks peace, but at the same time keeps pressure on until North Korea takes those steps.
I agree with Patrick. I think it's okay for President Moon to signal in advance the need for the international community to recognize actual steps by North Korea to abide by the UN Security Council resolutions, but we're not there yet. So in essence, I think what President Moon is trying to do is sort of lay the groundwork that would be necessary. But in terms of actually beginning now, to ease the sanctions pressure, I think it's way premature.
Mm-hmm. Now, French President Macron, in response, said that France is looking for a complete and verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of North Korea's nuclear weapons, and also said that France will not ease sanctions right now. And leaders of Germany and UK also stressed CVID. So what is your take on the European response?
Well, you know, France is one of the few countries in Europe that has not accredited an ambassador to the DPRK. Most of the other EU member states have normalized their diplomatic relations. And I think that it's good here that President Macron is taking a slightly firmer line. I think he's also signaling to the rest of Europe that France wants to be a leader in the process of normalization, or the EU support for a normalization process. And the EU can also play a really critical role here on the human rights issue, because the EU has been very outspoken, very resolute in communicating its concerns on these issues to North Korea. So I think it's interesting to me that rather than having the US essentially leading a European response, now you've got France stepping up.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very important. This is not just the United States trying to uphold the nuclear nonproliferation regime. Europe and the United States have been working for decades on trying to prevent the proliferation of dangerous nuclear weapons. That's why they passed those resolutions against North Korea building these nuclear weapons. That's why we need to hold the line to seek what now I think the U.S. administration calls a final, fully verified denuclearization.
Mm-hmm. Now, despite President Moon's efforts to ease sanctions on North Korea, members of ASEM adopted a joint statement, and they emphasize actually the full implementation of UN Security Council sanctions and also stressed a CVID on North Korea. So what is your take on among around 50 states of Europe and Asian countries emphasizing these 2 points?
Well, these are the right points. I mean, we need to see complete denuclearization. It needs to be verified. The question is, how can we achieve that? And I think that's where President Moon and South Korean government say, look, we're going to have to do this step-by-step, action for action. We're going to have to start somewhere. We may need to prime the pump in terms of giving incentives to North Korea. The United States is saying, fine, we'll be providing incentives, but we really can't go beyond symbols until we see significant commitments on the part of Pyongyang toward denuclearization. That may not get us towards CVID in the next 2 years, but it could get us significantly along the way, which would be much better than where we've been for decades. Question is, will we get there, or will we just get a little bit there, or will this fall apart? And that's what we're negotiating.
I think the ASEM statement does represent a victory for U.S. diplomacy behind the scenes. I'm sure that the White House was lobbying quietly to the ASEM members to really stand pat with respect to North Korea on sanctions. However, I'm a little bit worried that there's a growing gap between the rhetoric of the international community on sanctions and the reality. The reality is that the sanctions regime is weakening. Enforcement is weakening, especially the Chinese. So I think it's good that ASEM has reiterated their strong support for the sanctions regime until the North Koreans respond concretely.
On the sanctions enforcement, U.S. Treasury called South Korean banks and urged to comply with sanctions on North Korea and warned secondary sanctions against them. What is the message, and can the United States really sanction an ally?
Well, we can, but I don't think we will. I mean, this is a shot across the bow, and I think it would be extremely unlikely that the United States would imperil our economic relationship with South Korea because of some technical violations of a sanctions regime by some South Korean banks.
I take a little harder line view on this issue in terms of the Trump administration understands that it has to be the enforcer of sanctions. If it doesn't lead, then nobody will follow. And so, yeah, it is a shot across the bow, but I think if the interests continue to diverge and if South Korea tries to outpace on the inter-Korean relationship what we're doing on denuclearization with North Korea, I think secondary sanctions are at least a possibility. I don't think they could be drastic, but they would be, they'd go further down this road if they have to.
Mm-hmm. And if the denuclearization talks don't go well, would we expect a massive secondary sanctions on facilitators of North Korea?
Again, I think this will be kind of laddering up, ratcheting up the pressure, not drastic overnight, but there will be some dramatic symbolism to even sanctioning an ally's banks or the Bank of China. And I think that will send shudder waves around the region, and people will want to realign and see if they can't put more pressure on North Korea.
Mm-hmm. Now, North Korea and South Korea has been increasingly asking for easing of sanctions recently, and not so much end-of-war declaration. So do you think North Korea has changed its strategy to what to ask for at this moment?
I don't know what Patrick thinks. They've always wanted both. They've always wanted some political symbolism and then something they can eat. And I think that the balance is shifting a little bit. I think you're right, Yoon Jong.
No, I agree. So really you're left debating what's the order of things. And so some would say that the North Koreans are very serious about the order in which the Singapore summit listed peace first before denuclearization, and that President Trump allegedly gave Chairman Kim an assurance that he would allow an end-of-war declaration this year. And if he thinks that he already has that agreement in his pocket, let's move on to step 2. You want denuclearization, America? What are you going to pay me for Yongbyon? What are you going to pay me for this? And he's market testing how much he can get in sanctions relief and other support if he takes those steps. And that's what I think the negotiation behind the scene is partly about.
Mm-hmm. Now, South Korea contends that improved inter-Korean relations will give traction to denuclearization. Do you agree with this?
Well, look, there is a virtuous cycle that's possible if North-South relations improve, especially if North-South relations improve in a way that concretely enhances the security on the Korean Peninsula, the respect for the armistice, and and confidence-building measures. But at some point, if the South gets too far out in front of the denuclearization process, then you can have a kind of a vicious cycle where the U.S. Pulls on the South Koreans to try to rein them in and tries to increase pressure on the North to move. So I think for the moment, we're still in a phase where a steady improvement in North-South relations could unlock progress in U.S. DPRK denuclearization talks.
I think your viewers should certainly go and read the South Korean ambassador to the United States speech this week, where he talks rather passionately about how mistrust cannot be a strategy. It doesn't lead you, it doesn't tell you where to go from there. And he thinks that, yes, it is possible for the inter-Korean dialogue to sometimes be out front, because that could then catalyze denuclearization. I think from the Trump administration's view, they're very uncomfortable with the idea that one leg of that one channel could outpace the other. And I suspect that South Koreans pushing out the boundaries of this, and the United States trying to pull them back in, say, no, we're going to have to work in tandem on these issues. We can't really outpace each other.
Well, I think, we're joined by a rubber band,
yes.
and it's a little bit elastic, and the South can be a little bit out front, but at some point the tension is going to become too strong.
And you're feeling that right now. We're not getting the denuclearization, but we're getting the inter-Korean peace, and we're going to have to pull these together.
Good analogy. Last question. So what should be U.S. strategy against this South and North Korean campaign to ease sanctions when U.S. actually wants to maintain pressure?
I think we should continue to illuminate the path forward for North Korea. I think positive language about the kind of better future they could enjoy is powerful in Pyongyang. And then I think we need to be more explicit with them, either privately or maybe publicly, about the next steps on denuclearization which are necessary for them to enjoy those benefits. I think that rather than threaten the sanctions, which that's a threat that's always on the table, I think we need to illuminate the path forward, emphasize the better future they could enjoy, and then be very explicit about what we need them to do to realize that future.
Well, one, the United States needs to recognize that it's fully on board with the diplomacy as well. But it doesn't want to make a bad deal. So it has to be as careful as North Korea is being about meting out concessions. So in private discussions with North Korea, the United States needs to make sure we can agree to the next 3, 4, 5 steps that need to be taken that meet our interests on denuclearization and help reassure North Korea, South Korea, the region, that we're serious about this process. And we shouldn't just agree to one minor symbolic step as the next thing. We need to think about the next 3 or 4 things, because President Trump's going to have to sell this to maybe a divided Congress in 2019. And if he's going to get bipartisan support for his negotiations, there has to be something real, not just symbolic, to what we're doing with North Korea.
Well, we'll end this conversation here and watch video for our next topic.
Thank you.
Pope Francis received an invitation to visit North Korea relayed by South Korean President Moon Jae-in. The Pope responded he would consider a visit if he received an official invitation. And if it materializes, it will be North Korea's first papal visit. Now, can this papal visit go beyond symbolism and bring about true peace on the Korean Peninsula?
Well, that's asking for a lot from any visit or any summit. But in a funny way, over time, possibly. I mean, what we're looking for ultimately is to try to open up North Korean thinking about freedom, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of movement. That's not going to happen anytime in the next year or even 5 years, but maybe over the next 20 years, that should be a possibility. Why shouldn't North Koreans be living like South Koreans and have freedom of religion and freedom of speech? And in many ways, a visit by the Pope, while it'll be used for short-term political legitimacy gains for Kim Jong-un, it could sow the seeds of religious freedom.
You know, the Catholic Church has a long history on the Korean Peninsula, and Catholics in Korea also have a a troubled and long history, including mass migration at the onset of the Korean War by North Korean Catholics to the south. I think a papal visit would be very symbolic in its affirmation of the unity of the Korean people and the need for freedom of religion, freedom of speech, mobility, all of these important freedoms that Patrick outlined. And I think were the Pope to be accepted in the North in an official visit, it also says something about the North Korean government's attitude toward people of faith. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, as Patrick pointed out, there's no prospect of rapid change in the human rights situation in the North. And I think the Pope would have to be very cautious to make sure that he was absolutely clear both in the country and outside about the messages of religious freedom and tolerance and human rights that he must bring to Pyongyang.
Patrick, he mentioned about the human rights, and at a time when North Korea is the worst violator of human rights, wouldn't papal visit actually draw a backlash from the international community?
There will definitely be a backlash, and the Pope, the Holy Father, would be heavily criticized by his own Catholic constituency. When he came to the United States 3 years ago, he was happy to talk about the need for the fundamental right of religious freedom. Will he be bold enough to say that in North Korea? I'd love to hear that be said. He could win a lot of friends around the world, both Catholics and non-Catholic alike, if he would be so bold as to do that. But if he goes there, as Frank says, and ignores his own papal responsibility and his own religious sort of convictions, then I think there will be a great disappointment.
Frank, what does North Korea seek to gain from this visit?
I think this is part of Kim Jong-un's overall legitimacy campaign. They want to be seen as a normal country. Normal countries receive visits by leaders of the faithful. And he's also trying to soften his own personal image. And that imagery of Kim Jong-un welcoming Pope Francis, who is widely respected in the international community by Catholics and non-Catholics alike, would help to rehabilitate Kim Jong-un's personal image as leader of North Korea.
Pope Francis has visited Myanmar and Colombia before, but Pope visiting these conflict areas, does this really lead to a real resolution on the issues?
Definitely. No, it doesn't, of course. But then why would we expect one meeting to do that? What he's trying to do is to lend some support to a peace process that South Korean president is leading on, that the rest of the world is interested in supporting. President Trump is interested in supporting. So the Pope here is supporting and seeing himself potentially as supporting a peace process that could bring peace to the world. That's not a bad thing in and of itself. But why should his visit be asked to change and transform North Korea and the tyranny that they've been living under since the beginning of the Kim regime? That's too much to ask.
Yeah, no, exactly. His visit's no more likely to catalyze those changes than Trump's visit or Moon's visit or anyone else's visit.
Well, we'll wrap it up here and move on to our next segment. Now time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today we have a photo of a draft design for South Korea's new passport, which is drawing controversy in the country. The color of the passport will change from dark green to deep blue color, and critics say the new passport reminds them of the North Korean passport, which is also deep blue. South Korea will begin issuing new passports from 2020. Frank?
Well, names, documentation, iconography, all of these things are so important in international affairs. Look at the dispute between Macedonia and Greece over the name of Macedonia. So these things matter, and I hope that the South Koreans have carefully thought through the positive and negative implications of adopting symbolism. I think the goal is clearly to promote a concept of unity.
Patrick?
And we've seen this in the Pyeongchang Olympics, and we've seen it in every step that the Moon administration has taken. President Moon needs to think about, after he's out of office, he needs to keep all South Koreans united on this issue. And I wonder whether these steps may be, unfortunately, creating problems down the road for South Korean agreement on how to manage North Korea. So I think being very careful and cautious would be sort of advised for President Moon.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Frank, Patrick, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. What a great season.
Thank you. And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun Jung Cho. We'll be back after 2 weeks in the second week of November with new episodes.